Good afternoon, everyone. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm Director of the European Studies Center here at the University of Pittsburgh. For over 4 years, we've all carefully watched what could be called the Brexit circus from across the pond. And today I'm very pleased to welcome a true expert on the topic, one who I've tried to get here multiple times, both in person, predominantly in person over the last year, but we're very happy to welcome Anand Menon here today virtually, who will discuss what happened and where things are headed. Today's talk is funded through our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence grant. There will be plenty of time for questions after Anand's talk, so feel free to put questions in the chat or the Q&A during or after the talk, and I will do my best to get to as many of them as I can. Anand Menon is Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. He also directs the UK in a Changing Europe project, which you will hear a lot about during his talk. His areas of research and interest include the policies and institutions of the European Union, European security, and British politics. He contributes regularly to both print and broadcast media. He's the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of the European Union, published by Oxford University in 2012, and co-author of Brexit and British Politics, published by Polity in 2018. He's a trustee of Full Fact, a member of the Strategic Council of the European Policy Center, a council member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and an associate fellow of Chatham House. Welcome, Anand.
JJ, thank you very, very much indeed. And it really is sad that I can't actually be there. 2 trips to Pittsburgh, I think I've had to cancel over the last few years. And I think it was one last March that broke my heart because of lockdown. But welcome, everyone, and thanks for coming along. I'll talk for about 45 minutes. If my voice holds out that long, because I should warn you, I'm going to get quite croaky, I think, halfway through this. And just by way of an outline, this is what I'm hoping to get through. Talk about the agreement that the UK and the EU have signed. Talk about what it means for the relationship going forward. Discuss the economic impact of the UK according to the economic forecast. Talk about the politics and briefly talk. I probably, for a US audience, should have put a bit more in on foreign policy and transatlantic relations, but feel free to ask questions on that. Equally, I'm not going to talk very much about Northern Ireland, the protocol, or Scotland, but again, if you've got questions on that, I'm very, very happy to answer them. So if we can kick off then with the famous trade and cooperation agreement, I want to talk about 3 things. Firstly, having a deal is a big deal. I think that's the first point worth making, is whatever criticisms can legitimately made of the TCA, and I'm going to make some myself, and there are many more you can make, having a deal is fundamentally different to not having a deal. And it's fundamentally different, I think, not just in the narrow economic sense that with a deal, you would have tariffs and quotas. With a deal, you don't have tariffs and quotas. Without a deal, you would have tariffs and quotas. But I really think that had the negotiations broken down in December, and there were a couple of times in December where, frankly, it looked like they might, it wasn't just a question of trade cooperation that was at stake. It was a question of the broader diplomatic relationship between the UK and the 27. That is to say, had the talks broken up in acrimony, both sides would have blamed the other. There'd have been a lot of mutual recrimination, finger pointing. And I think then cooperation across a swathe of issues, whether it is coordinating our responses to what's happening in Russia, working together in NATO, and particularly collaborating on climate change, all those things would have become far, far more difficult. So having an agreement really matters. And the agreement does quite a lot. I mean, it more or less gives us tariff-free trade. There's a rules of origin wrinkle to that I can talk about if you're really into that sort of thing. It does far more on security cooperation than I, for one, thought it would. That's internal security cooperation. We knew from a long time back that the UK government didn't want to talk about foreign policy. It sorts fisheries out, which you might say, so what? But fisheries almost held the whole thing up and scuppered the talks as a whole. It covers aviation, road transport, energy, social security, business travel, and there's a massive load of stuff about governance. 19 subcommittees are going to be set up by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So it does an awful lot, but it is worth saying it doesn't do what membership does. There is a massive difference between what we've signed up to and what membership gives us. If you look at this, it'll give you some idea of the difference. But the big gaps, I think, are, firstly, being outside the single market and the customs union means, even for goods, and I'll come back onto this when I talk about the economic impact, there is significant friction in trade between the UK and the EU because there's a need for customs declarations, there's a need for checks, there's a need to certify your goods in both the EU and the UK, which involves additional time and additional cost. And all the more so for services. Services get virtually nothing from the trade and cooperation agreement. There is, as there would be, I suppose, because these things are negotiated by lawyers, a small carve out for lawyers who practice English and Welsh law. Apart from that, though, the things that the UK government wanted at one stage, mutual recognition of qualifications isn't there, which means if you're an architect and you want to go and practice in a member state, you've got to check if your credentials are good in that member state. You'll also need to get a visa. If you're a musician, you'll also, let's say you're the third violinist in the Paris Symphony Orchestra and you're called over one day from London to go and play. You probably won't be able to because you'll need to secure a visa and to register your instrument and pay for the privilege before you go. So a whole load of frictions introduced into the trading relationship that weren't there beforehand. And the third thing worth saying about the TCA, I think, is that it doesn't settle everything. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief on Christmas Eve. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief on Christmas Eve. I was just furious that they decided to sign the agreement on Christmas Eve because it wrecked my Christmas. But traders thought, okay, fine, we've resolved stuff now. But actually, in many ways, the TCA is the start of a process rather than the end of a process. Why? Well, firstly, we're still waiting for EU decisions on financial services and on data adequacy, which means, if we get good decisions, then some financial services can continue as now, though by no means all, and we can use data from the European Union. Without those decisions, there's another massive impact on trade and indeed on security. Secondly, there's an ongoing process because of this so-called rebalancing clause, which means that if either side thinks the other has changed regulations in a way that has a material impact on trade, they can retaliate with tariffs. So tariffs are still a possibility if the UK government makes good on some of its more, well, you can say ambitious, you can say mad, depending on your perspective, rhetoric about, getting rid of loads of regulations imposed on us by the European Union. The EU can retaliate. So traders have got to be braced for the potential of the imposition of tariffs. There's cross retaliation across different sectors. We have to renegotiate the fisheries deal in 5.5 years. And of course, if the British decide to reduce the quota that the EU have, then there's cross retaliation via tariffs possible as well. And finally, every 5 years, we have to review this deal. So implementing it, reviewing it, making sure it works properly is going to take up a lot of time of a lot of people. There is a Switzerland element to this TCA in the sense that there's the prospect of the UK and the EU being locked into an almost permanent cycle of negotiation. So thinking now more about the substantive aspects of this, I want to turn to what the economic impact of Brexit has been, but more importantly, what the economic impact of Brexit might be going forward. This slide shows some work done by John Springford at a think tank called the Centre for European Reform. And what they did was they basically got a doppelganger, a basket of economies that have historically, if you go to the left of the referendum line, that have historically performed very much like the UK economy. And they've basically extrapolated on from the referendum, seeing how that basket of economies have performed and comparing it to how the UK economy has performed. And what you'll see is their estimate is up to the first quarter of 2018, when they stopped publishing these things so regularly. Even by the first quarter of 2018, the Brexit impact on the UK economy had been around 2.5% of GDP. Part of that was trade diversion. Part of it was companies thinking, well, hang on, if it's going to get harder, we might start making alternative arrangements. And particularly, I think firms in the EU 27, faced with the prospect of disruption with trade with the UK, resource stuff or try to find other markets that would remain within the single market. The other big thing that we've lost out on in terms of our economy, I think, over the last 5 years is investment. That is to say, many investment decisions were either cancelled or postponed because companies wanted to see what it was they were investing in, what sort of access there would be to the single market, what the relationship would be between the United Kingdom and the European Union. That's quite important. If you're a major car firm thinking about where to invest, then you might think, actually, we'll do it somewhere else. And, you know, during this process, we've seen Tesla decide to relocate a battery factory that was intended for the United Kingdom in another member state. And actually, Tesla said quite boldly, this was because of Brexit. So what does it all mean? What do the checks and impediments mean? Well, in aggregate terms, and I mean, this is a forecast, okay? And, you know, you've got to take forecasts with a pinch of salt. Forecasts aren't predictions. These forecasts are for the difference between the UK economy had it remained within the European Union and what will happen with the deal. So the bars on the left are the impact of, is the comparison between the deal and EU membership. I can't stress enough, this isn't saying there's going to be a 6% drop in per capita income over the next 10 years. What that's saying is per capita income in 10 years' time will be 6% lower than we now expect it would have been had we remained in the single market and the customs union. But with that rider, it's worth just acknowledging the simple fact that these figures are eye-wateringly huge. If you look at the impact on trade, and that is where the overall aggregate economic impact comes from, the fact of making trade with our nearest and largest trading partner more difficult, more time-consuming, and of course, therefore more expensive, is expected to lead to a 30-odd% reduction in imports from and exports to the European Union. And that in turn will have an impact on income per capita in the UK. Not least, of course, because most economists think that there is a productivity impact via trade, that trade tends to boost productivity because of competition, and that might be lost. So by any measure, this scale of impact is a large one. It's an impact over 10 years. And to give you a comparative perspective, if I show you this, these are the forecasts about what the impact of COVID would be relative to the impact of Brexit. There are a couple of things worth noting here. Firstly, if you look right to the far right, the striking conclusion is over a period of 20 years, go back to my pinch of salt with forecast, but over a period of 20 years, looking at that graph, the impact of Brexit with a deal will be about 3 times larger than the impact of COVID. That's quite simply because if you look at where the orange curve goes down, the COVID impact will be short and very, very sharp. But most economists expect that over time, we will recover from the COVID impact, economies will open up again, jobs will be found for those who find themselves unemployed as we emerge from lockdown in this country. And so much of that growth will be caught up. There's only a small loss from COVID over the long term, whereas the loss from Brexit is, as they say, forever. That drag factor will continue as long as we are trading on the terms that we have just agreed with the European Union. Now, for me as a political scientist, well, actually, before I get onto that, let me just say one thing. One question that's quite interesting is, where do the losses because of Brexit come from? This is a stolen piece of paper, I suppose. This is a leak of the forecasts done by the British government in the early part of 2017. This is a diagram that found its way into the pages of BuzzFeed in early 2017. The bars below that line are the negative impact of Brexit on the British economy under various scenarios. And there's 2 things I think I would like you just to focus on. Firstly, the blue diagonal line are the negative impact of non-tariff barriers on the British economy. And the point to bear in mind there is, it is non-tariff barriers that were always going to be the biggest drag factor in terms of trade with the European Union. Tariffs are a relatively trivial part of the costs incurred as a result of Brexit. And non-tariff barriers, of course, are hardly addressed in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which focuses on tariffs and quotas. So non-tariff barriers make up the bulk of the distortion that will occur to UK-EU trade. The second thing to bear in mind is the teeny little bit above the line. That teeny little bit above the line is the expected gains from regulatory independence. The UK now has regulatory independence. We can do what we want because we're not bound by EU law. What will that mean? Well, that's what the Treasury thought, not very much at all. It's that very, very thin black strip. And equally interesting and equally important, the other part of the bit above the line is the expected gains of trade deals with all those countries listed at the bottom of the graph. Okay? all those 20 or so countries, 20 is off the top of my head, I haven't counted them. If we sign trade deals with all of them, the expected benefit is that kind of order of magnitude as compared to the negative impact of Brexit. And if you're wondering why, the simple answer in one word is geography. All those countries are quite a long way away from us, and as a result, we don't trade with them very much at all. Now, I'm a political scientist, so my big question about all of this is, so what? What does it mean? What does it mean for the future of British politics? Let me start with this before I actually get on to the political agenda per se. The top picture in that slide is a picture of the increasing number of people who came to believe that the UK would be worse off because of Brexit. More and more people over this period, and I'm sorry I haven't extended these things like I should, but actually what you'll find is that that number's got even, the negative numbers got even bigger. More and more people now think that the economic impact of Brexit will be negative. If you want a good recent source for this, the British Social Attitudes Survey came out in last December, and that has some recent figures that show even a significant proportion of Leave voters now expect the impact of Brexit on the national economy to be negative. But if you look at the diagram below, YouGov have done this tracker over the last, well, since the referendum, asking people, was it the right decision or the wrong decision to leave the European Union? The blue line is wrong decision, the green line is right decision, and yes, blue has overtaken green, but not by much. And if you extrapolate further on, if I'd made those figures go up to today, the gap would be bigger, but it wouldn't be huge. In other words, even though more and more people, significantly more people have come to think that the impact of Brexit will be negative, there's been relatively little shift in the polls for a number of reasons, I think. One, if you're thinking about Leave voters, well, let me say, first of all, to the extent that a shift has happened so that we now have a majority for Brexit being a bad decision rather than a good decision, the wrong decision rather than the right decision, sorry, let me say a couple of things. That doesn't mean that had we had a referendum, there was an automatic majority for Remain, because a lot of the people who think Brexit was the wrong decision also thought we should leave because we'd had a referendum and voted to leave. So they thought there was a democratic mandate, even if the decision was stupid, in other words. Secondly, much of the shift from right decision to wrong decision took place not because a whole load of leavers changed their minds. There's relatively little data showing, little evidence that lots of leavers have changed their minds. The reason the polls have changed, quite simply, is because people who either abstained in 2016 or, more numerically important, people who were too young to vote in 2016 but now can now say that they would vote Remain. And, you know, to put it gruesomely, because Leave voters are old and young people are overwhelmingly more likely to vote Remain, there's a demographic churn here, new people entering the electoral register and older voters dying. So that's part of the reason why, not people changing their minds. Why aren't people changing their minds? Some leavers simply don't believe the forecast. They just say, well, this is all nonsense. You know, you keep giving us forecasts. George Osborne used to tell us the economy was performing really well and I didn't have a job. So there are people who just downright don't believe it. There are people who don't believe aggregates. So yeah, okay, the British economy might fall, but you know, my position won't change because those numbers mean nothing to me. And there are a significant number of people, I think, who firmly believe that getting out of the European Union is a good thing to do for whatever reason. It might be because of getting out of the EU. It might be to sort of send a shot across the bows of the British establishment, but that it's worth paying an economic price to achieve. And remember, even though we've spent the last 5 years discussing the left behinds and their vote for Brexit, the majority of people who voted for Brexit weren't the left behind. They were relatively affluent Tory voters in the Shires. People, in other words, who could afford to absorb an economic hit. So that's where public opinion is. And the conclusion that I would invite you to take from this is that even though you've just seen all the economic slides I've shown you, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a sudden shift in opinion and in a couple of years' time the Brits are going to be going, oh my God, what have we done? And I think there are two reasons for that. Well, the simple reason is you've probably all heard the metaphor of a cliff edge, people talking about a Brexit cliff edge. It's a fundamentally misleading metaphor because the impact of Brexit on the UK economy is going to be more like the impact of a slow puncture on your bike. And there are two things about a slow puncture on your bike. Firstly, it takes you ages to notice. So this is a process of accretion, of growth foregone. And over time, the British economy will not perform as well as the economies in the single market and the customs union, but it will take us a while to notice. It won't be like that massive COVID dip. And of course, the second thing about a slow puncture is when you finally realize you've got one, you probably can't remember where you got it. And so let's say in 10 years' time, the Brits are thinking to themselves, oh, hang on a sec, what's happening to the economy? Plausibly, people who supported Brexit will say, oh, that's because of a slowdown in growth in China. That's because of the new German government doing whatever it is. It would be harder, in other words, to link that narrative back to a decision that people took in 2016. But let me just talk briefly about the politics in more detail. I think for me, the two key questions about this Parliament are whether or not the government manages to achieve its levelling up agenda, or at least show that it's serious about achieving that agenda. I think that's fundamental because that comes from Brexit, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But secondly, whether or not Brexit remains a key political division inside the UK. So let me start with the first. Britain needs to be levelled up. That's the first thing. We have a level of interregional inequality that is far outstrips any other EU member state. I think figures from a couple of years ago show that if you take the gap between the most and least productive parts of the UK economy, that gap is on the similar scale to the gap between the most and least productive parts of the Eurozone as a whole. This played out a little bit in the referendum, because one of the trends we see in the referendum is that relatively poorer areas were disproportionately likely to vote Leave. This is the map of, actually I've been a bit lazy here, I've used a map. Let me explain those stars to you so you can understand what I'm talking about. The yellow areas are the areas that voted Remain, the blue areas are the areas that voted Leave, and yes, I've cut out Scotland and Northern Ireland, for which apologies, but I'm trying to make a point with this map. The stars come from the fact that there was some conversation that you don't need to bother yourselves with in this country about the fact that people who liked Pret-a-Manger, the cafe chain, were liberal, cosmopolitan elitists. And in our office one day, we decided to figure out where the Prets were in the United Kingdom. And actually, those red stars are the locations of Pret. So Pret is an explanatory variable when it comes to Brexit, if you look at that. But the serious point is, it tends to be in the affluent, young, urban areas where you will find Prets that people voted Remain. So already part of the rationale behind Brexit was people who did not have as much voting in a kind of protest vote. That's where the narrative of the left behind has come from. Now, if that was true, and both Theresa May and Boris Johnson have admittedly, have implicitly said it's true, because both committed to this levelling up project, which came straight out of the Brexit referendum, there are two fundamental problems that the Prime Minister now faces in trying to achieve this levelling up. The first is that with coronavirus, our expectation is coronavirus will increase existing inequalities. Those black circles are the places we expect to lose the fewest jobs coming out of the pandemic. And what you will see is they are largely in yellow areas. That's to say, the most affluent parts of the United Kingdom will be least badly affected by unemployment as we come out of the coronavirus crisis. So we will become even less leveled up as a result of the pandemic. The second thing I should say is the darker areas are the areas most exposed to Brexit. There is, according to some studies, an almost perfect correlation between how strongly a region voted to leave the European Union and how exposed its economy is to trade with the European Union. The two lightest parts of that map are London and Scotland, which are the two parts of the United Kingdom that voted most strongly to remain. So the two parts of the country that voted most strongly to remain are the two parts of the country that are going to be, by this calculation, economically the least impacted by Brexit. Now, there is a row amongst economists about this, because some economists are saying that Remain areas are disproportionately services based, and because there's less in the trade deal for services than there is in goods, this might not be true. So it might be that Brexit hits the country equally. But bear in mind a final thing, which is this crucial concept of resilience. Prosperous, young, diverse, well-educated places tend to be economically far more resilient, which means that they bounce back quicker from economic shocks. And they tend to be remain voting places rather than leave voting places. So if Boris Johnson genuinely wants to deliver on this levelling up, which will appeal to those new voters that he won over in 2019 from the Labour Party, he's got a double whammy. He's got the triple whammy. He's got the pre-existing inequality to address, on top of which is layered the additional inequality that adds to this, that comes from COVID, on top of which quite possibly is a further widening of the economic gap because of the impact of Brexit. The impact of Brexit is also political. If you look at this, that is a chart. If you just bear with me, I'm going to have a quick sip of my cup of tea because my voice is going, so just excuse me. That graph illustrates the correlation between how you voted in the Brexit referendum and your social values. If you're a social conservative, or a social authoritarian, which is called in some of the, we've tried not to use the word social authoritarian, even though it's used in political science, because people get a bit confused when you use that to a public audience. It's like authoritarian. But basically, the more socially conservative you are, the more likely you are to have voted for Brexit. And this is a big deal. And it's a big deal because as Brexit became a key political issue in the United Kingdom, the electoral basis of our politics shifted. Our politics was class politics. That's the first thing you learn about UK politics is all you need to know is it based on class, economic interests and class. Brexit changed that. The change was happening to an extent beforehand, but Brexit reinforced it and speeded it up. And so you ended up with traditional conservative areas like Kensington voting for Labour in 2017, with traditional Labour areas like Stoke voting Conservative in 2017. Why? Because this electoral cleavage, the cleavage between social liberals and social conservatives, was challenging the traditional one between left and right. And that happened in spades in December 2019. What Boris Johnson did last December was basically assemble a Leave coalition. 82% of the people who voted Conservative at the last election were Leave supporters. And I'll leave that with you. I'm going to come back to it for a moment because I think it's key to how our politics develops over the next few years. Next thing I would say is that those identities, Leave and Remain identities, have remained very, very strong. I should also have added in this, you would be looking at under 20% if you were to track the numbers of people who had strong Conservative or Labour Party identities. That is to say, in the UK still, your Brexit identity is stronger for most people than your party political identity. Far more people self-identify as a Leaver or a Remainer than identify as Labour or Conservative. And actually, we've seen some fascinating research done. Sarah Hobart at the LSE did some wonderful survey work on this, in which she found, and this, for the, I imagine most of you in the United States, so you never know with Zoom, this might resonate with you in the United States in terms of sort of polarization, that over 50% of Remain voters would refuse to rent a room in their house to a Leave voter. Over 50% of Remain voters would be very or extremely unhappy if one of their kids married a Leave voter. I mean, this polarization runs very, very deep. And as of yet, it shows no sign of dissipating. Whether it does or not is going to hinge crucially on this, which is the Ipsos Mori salience tracker. Ipsos Mori asked people every month what the most important issues facing the UK are. The black line won't surprise you, but one of the big questions we have here is, remember, that red line is still in second place, that we cut off at the end of last year. I haven't seen the most recent figures. The big unknown is what happens to the blue line. Most economists expect us to be facing an unemployment crisis of a scale we haven't seen since the 1980s as we emerge from lockdown. That blue line will probably take pride of place at the top of that diagram by about Easter of next year. where Brexit sits there is going to be absolutely fundamental as to whether or not our politics goes back to being centered on economic divisions, the size of the state, the generosity of welfare spending, whether the government's doing enough to promote employment, or whether that values divide associated with Brexit remains salient. And a lot of that will depend on how the disruption caused by Brexit at ports pans out. Will companies keep on day after day being in the newspapers saying, I've had to close down my company because I can no longer trade with the Netherlands. My flower shop has got to shut because I haven't got any flowers anymore. We don't know is the simple answer. But it matters profoundly, I think, for the future of British foreign policy because of this. This is some work we at the UK and Changing Europe did on the political parties in the United Kingdom. And what we did was we got a variety of surveys of MPs, of party activists and of voters. And we sort of compared their answers on questions of both traditional economics. So on the left is the traditional left wing of economics, on the right is the right wing. At the top are, I use authoritarian, having said I wouldn't, I'm sorry, but conservative social values. At the bottom, liberal social values. And we plotted MPs, party activists and voters. Oh my God, that wasn't meant to happen, sorry. So the first thing you will note, that's clever, isn't it? The first thing you'll notice, I'll try not to touch the mouse if it's going to keep doing that. The first thing you will notice is that the Conservatives on social values are relatively closely bunched compared to how they are on economics. MPs are still outliers. Conservative MPs, when we did this survey, which was a year ago, so I suspect that MPs will have shifted closer after the election of last year. MPs are probably still slightly more socially liberal than activists and voters, but only slightly more. From that, what you can say is it is in the interests of the Conservatives for the electoral battleground to be on values, because they are closer to the voters they have, and particularly to those 2019 Labour to Conservative voters, than they are over economic issues. The gap between Tory MPs and 2019 switchers on economics is huge. Why? Because most Tory MPs are Tories, okay? Certainly the ones we polled a year before the 2019 election are traditional Tories, small state, small welfare state, low levels of taxation, low levels of redistribution. That's changed a little bit now. The Conservative Party in Parliament is divided because those 2019 Labour to Conservative switchers have elected Conservative MPs in traditional Labour areas. But even if that's true, that the Parliamentary Party is now more divided on economic issues, it's still in the interest of the Conservatives to try not to talk about economics, because if you look at the red, Labour are all over the place on values. You know, the gap between Labour MPs and those switchers from 2019 is huge on values, though they are almost in the identical place when it comes to economics. So Keir Starmer, the reason he doesn't want to talk about Brexit or talk about the Brexit deal, or least of all talk about rejoining, which he'll never do, I guarantee you, is because they want to shift the battle onto economic policy, onto where the Tories have screwed up with the pandemic, onto competence, onto why they've allowed spiraling levels of unemployment. And in a sense, the terrain for political competition is going to be crucial moving into the next election. Expect the Tories to talk about Brexit all the time. One of the reasons why we're having this spat over the EU ambassador to London is because it's lighting the blue touch paper to wind up the Tory base. It's good politics for Boris Johnson. It's not great for UK-EU relations. So that is where we are with the politics. I'm just now, and yes, this is a hastily inserted slide because you're a transatlantic, you're a US audience, is talk briefly about foreign policy before wrapping up. As I mentioned before, Boris Johnson would not negotiate foreign policy with the European Union, so there is no institutionalized link between the UK and the EU when it comes to foreign policy. That being said, obviously, the UK and the EU are going to have to work together because geography condemns us to work together on foreign policy, because it provides, it exposes us to shared threats and gives us shared interests. Now, for the UK, this is possibly the biggest year for decades in foreign policy. Partly because the government is determined to show that post-Brexit UK isn't parochial and insular and inward-looking, we're global, so we talk all about global Britain a lot. Secondly, because we take over the presidency, the chairmanship of the UN Security Council. Thirdly, because we take over the chairmanship of the G7. And fourthly, because with Italy, the UK is co-hosting the COP26 UN Environmental Summit at the end of this year. All those reasons mean that I suspect we're going to see a very, very activist UK foreign policy. And actually, on foreign policy, it's interesting. We have a slightly Janus-faced prime minister, a prime minister who will play the populist game at home, revoking parliament, sneering about the media, making disparaging comments about Black Lives Matter, whatever it may be, and playing that values game at home. Internationally, he's a completely different prime minister. This is a government that speaks out in favor of liberal internationalism, the rule-based order, that criticizes China for human rights abuses, a strong proponent of NATO, strongly backing international measures to combat climate change. One of the interesting things about that is, even though there are well-publicized differences and disagreements in terms of temperament, in terms of what they've said in the past between the Biden administration and the Johnson administration, this isn't going to be a question of very close friendship and seeing eye to eye. Despite that, the substantive foreign policy agendas of the Biden team and the Johnson team are very, very similar indeed. Johnson disagreed with Trump over Russia, over Iran, over climate, over NATO. And so I suspect that, to many people's surprise, we will see a relatively good level. My camera's frozen, there's nothing I can do about it. I hope the position isn't too embarrassing, but I can't get out of it while I'm doing slides, so just shut your eyes or something if it's hideous. You will see a lot of collaboration between the UK and the US on foreign policy, but, and it's a big but, and I've been lazy here and just sort of photographed a tweet. Tom knows his stuff when it comes to the Biden administration, and his point is a good one. It's not enough for the UK to work with the US. It has to work in a sort of trilateral way with the US and the EU. And this will be the real test for Boris Johnson. Is, as I've said before, in political terms, picking fights with the EU is good politics in the contemporary United Kingdom. On the other hand, if he picks fights with the EU, working together with the EU on a shared foreign policy agenda that we collaborate with the United States on, is going to become all the more difficult. That, I think, is the key question for transatlantic relations going forward. Not whether the UK can work with the US, because it can. And indeed, on many issues like China, the UK is closer to the US than the EU is. But whether or not the UK can also bring the EU into that collaborative conversation and those collaborative actions, because I strongly suspect, like Tom, that actually that will be what the Biden administration expects. I'm going to finish off very quickly because I'm just so humiliated by that frozen picture. Actually, basically, you can read those yourselves, can't you? Brexit isn't over. The impacts will be felt for a while to come. It'll impact on other policy agendas like levelling up. Will it continue to shape our politics? I don't know. I just clicked it off the screen. And I can't remember what the last point was. This lecture's gone slightly pear-shaped at the end, doesn't it? The international implications might not be as big as people think. Now, I'm hoping that someone at Pittsburgh can rescue me by putting Zoom back on, and I'm going to turn my camera off and then turn it on again with the hope that I am now moving. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Anand. And you have returned and you are moving now, so.
My camera does this my computer has so had enough of lockdown.
Yours and the rest of ours, but not to worry, you were not in any sort of compromised frozen state, so not to worry. Well, thank you. This was great, and I know has already generated lots of questions. So I will, to those in the audience, if you have questions, you can pose them in the chat, which everyone will see, or you can put them in the Q&A and then I will only see them. So either way, and I will work through some of these. Okay, so Anand, first we have a couple of questions that came up at various points about things that you have said. So we'll kind of rewind a little bit. So question about fisheries.
Yeah.
And obviously those are a huge sticking point for the negotiations. Hard for perhaps us to understand on this side, sort of understanding how this was so important to the negotiation. So perhaps you could chat a bit more about that to start off.
They have a huge symbolic importance. In this country, they have a symbolic importance because they have been associated with the Brexit cause. The fisheries was talked about a lot during the referendum. Nigel Farage, if you remember, organised a little flotilla of fishermen to float up the Thames, where they were confronted by Bob Geldof in what was a hugely humiliating day for the country, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, so there's a sort of symbolic element to it. There is a levelling up element to it. Coastal communities are poor communities, and actually delivering for the fishermen, and I don't think Boris Johnson has, I have to say, but delivering or being seen to deliver for the fishermen was important for the levelling up agenda. And equally on the other side of the channel, the fisheries madness wasn't a British madness. It was a madness in France as well. I mean, lots of governments were very, very concerned about fisheries. There are elections in France next year, including in Calais, for the mayor of Calais. Screwing the fishermen is not a way for Macron to guarantee success in those kind of elections. There's also a tradition of activism amongst French fishermen. No one in Paris wants to see raw fish dumped on the streets of Paris ever again. There is talk of the fishermen doing that in the UK now. We'll have to wait and see. Fishermen have lost out very badly from this deal in two ways, as far as they're concerned. One, they haven't got the massive increase in catch they were promised. They're getting 25% over 5 years more. And secondly, for a lot of, there was always this perfect interdependence over fisheries. The British sell and export the fish that we catch because we don't eat it. We don't like herring particularly, and a lot of seafood actually gets a better price in the rest of the EU than it ever got here. And we import the fish we eat. So the debate was couched for Brexit in terms of the catch. We forgot about the market. And so what we're finding now is a lot of Scottish seafood fishermen are not able to trade with the European Union anymore because the delays caused by paperwork and bureaucracy simply means that that product is no longer fresh when it arrives in Spain. And let's face it, even the Spanish don't eat moldy seafood. So there are real problems over the fisheries deal, and there is a real dissatisfaction amongst those communities. The one thing I would say that is absolutely fundamental is whether or not the Scottish National Party can turn that dissatisfaction to its advantage. Because Scottish pro-Brexit fishermen might not necessarily have been massive fans of independence because they didn't like the common fisheries policy, but whether or not they revisit that now in the light of what's happened is going to be crucial in Scottish politics.
Great, thank you. So I think a question that is coming up in various ways, and I think something that many of us in the US are curious about, which is if the UK will still be influential in European politics, and how?
The UK is a medium-sized country which has, good diplomatic, military, and intelligence networks, arguably the best in the European Union, or near the best in some of them. And it's a large economy. So yes, the UK will be influential, but not in the same way. We are going to be influential now as a competitor in many areas. I mean, foreign policy will be different, but when it comes to the economics, one of the interesting things about the Brexit negotiations was the EU wasn't willing to give us the kinds of deal it gave Canada over rules of origin, for instance. Why? Because Canada isn't a competitor. We are a competitor. We are now seen through that lens. If you're interested, I did a piece in The Guardian about this the other day, where I argued that actually, sadly, I think relations between the UK and the EU will remain strained. On our side, because the politics plays that way. On their side, because not only are we seen as a competitor, but it is in the vested political interest of a number of EU leaders, not least Macron, to be able to argue that Brexit was a failure. If you're up against a populist opponent in an election, and the French president is next year, you don't want Brexit to look like a really good thing. And that's one reason, actually, why the current vaccine row and its fallout is absolutely fundamental, I think, both to the future of the EU and its legitimacy, and to the domestic political fortunes of a lot of EU leaders. If the idea sticks that because we were free from the bureaucracy of Brussels, the UK has been able to roll out its vaccine so much faster than EU member states, I think that is politically a really, really big deal, because then you're literally talking about life and death.
Great, thank you for that. So somewhat perhaps relatedly, given how controversial Brexit is and was, how likely do you think it will be that the UK will try to rejoin the EU down the line?
Well, it depends how long the line is, I suppose. Not for the foreseeable future, I don't think. I mean, the necessary but not sufficient condition is that one of the two big political parties adopts rejoin. Labour are so far, I mean, obviously it won't be the Conservatives because the Conservatives are the party of leave. Labour don't want to go near it. If you watch Keir Starmer, and you know, maybe for good reason. I think the Labour position isn't great in a number of ways, but Keir Starmer does not want to even talk about closer relations with the EU because he'll get sucked into a debate about freedom of movement, let alone talking about rejoining. There are a few Labour MPs who want to talk about rejoining, but I just don't see that being a prospect for at least the next couple of elections, and almost certainly significantly longer than that, I would have thought. Bear in mind as well that if the UK decided it wanted to rejoin, we'd have to have a referendum, and that referendum would have to sell membership on terms far less favourable to the UK than the terms we rejected in the last referendum. There'd be no budget rebate. We'd almost certainly have to sign up to the Eurozone. That opt-out would go, possibly Schengen as well. So we would be signing up to a deal we found far less palatable than the one we rejected in 2016.
Okay, so we have a bunch of questions sort of on on the economics of Brexit and on the gap that you discussed. So one, in particular, to start with, what kinds of economic development initiatives does the UK plan to follow in order to help minimize the gap in GDP loss because of Brexit?
Well, let me say several things. I'm sorry, but my answers are all a bit too long. Firstly, it's not necessarily about GDP loss anymore. It's more about the distributive consequences of Brexit. That's to say, for this government, I think showing that you've narrowed the gap and that you've helped some of those communities that haven't been helped for a long time is as important politically as aggregate GDP. The fact of the matter is, as those tiny little black bars on the Treasury forecast showed, is it's hard to imagine things we can do that would make up for the aggregate GDP hit of Brexit. Yeah, around the edges, we can do some regulating better, I imagine. We might have a bit of an advantage over fintech. It would have to be, you know, sodding good regulation to outweigh the advantage the EU has because of its sheer market size. That's probably something worth noting. And the second thing, of course, is we need to be careful because the long-term sort of traditional Tory dream of leaving the European Union so we could engage in a bonfire of the regulations, you know, turn the UK into sort of Singapore-on-Thames. There are the level playing field provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And then there's that Brexit trade-off that has haunted us for 5 years, will continue to haunt us. Is it worth doing that if it suddenly means the imposition of tariffs on our car manufacturers, for instance? So it is hard to see. There are clearly some things we can do better. Obviously, you should be able to regulate better for your market than the EU does for a market of 27 very, very different member states. I would like to think that most anyone can come up with a slightly more effective agriculture policy than the Common Agricultural Policy. So there are areas, but whether they are going to have a massive impact on GDP, then I suspect not. Because, you know, we're a global free trading nation, except when it comes to our closest and biggest trading partner, with whom we're quite protectionist. And that is not a recipe for economic success. Though it might be a recipe for, you know, reclaiming democratic control. And for many Brexiters, the argument about Brexit was a political one, not an economic one.
So I have more economic related questions, but to those in the audience that have been putting questions in the chat, because there are so many of them, it'll be easier for me to keep track of them if you cut and paste them into the Q&A. So if you can go back to your question, if you did post something and just put it in the Q&A, which is down at the bottom of your screen, that would be great. Okay, so related to issues of economics and trade, a couple of some questions about the prospects for a US-Great Britain trade deal. Is this better now than under Trump, or perhaps worse?
Probably the same. I mean, one of the interesting things about Trump, for all the talk about the close relationship between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, is Donald Trump never did us any favor. I mean, you know, America first meant what it said on the tin, really. So he wasn't going to do any favors in a trade deal. And for Joe Biden, there isn't the political imperative that Trump might have felt to help Brexit Britain, quite the contrary. And of course, Joe Biden's priority isn't trade. It isn't sort of making globalization work better. It is sort of responding to the domestic constituencies that put him in office. So I don't think a trade deal is in sight for quite a while. And I should also bear in mind, some of our colleagues at the LSE did some modelling of this back in 2017, so the numbers might have changed. But anyway, if the UK and the EU were to sign a trade deal removing every single tariff on trade, the net benefit to the UK economy would be about 0.4% of GDP. And of course, as soon as you get into regulations, then there are political problems on both sides. If you're talking about harmonization of regulations, we're both a bit allergic to that. So actually, you know, most of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked when it comes to tariffs in UK, EU, US trade. I mean, it's worth making that point. I know I've just said my answers were too long, I'm sorry. That trade policy is explicitly, not uniquely maybe, but explicitly and primarily political. It is about holding up a piece of paper and saying, we've got the trade deal, Brexit, Britain is back on the global stage. It's not about the details of what that trade deal does.
Great, thank you. So why don't we turn to Northern Ireland, which you promised you would talk about in the Q&A.
Yeah. I'm regretting those words now.
Now I will ask you. So a couple of things, specifically, obviously, the Good Friday Agreement that has come up, and not related to Northern Ireland, but perhaps in the answer you can also talk about Scotland if you'd like. This has also come up a bit as well, and sort of the secession referendum that Nicola Sturgeon has now brought back on the table since as the Brexit process has proceeded. And yeah, so I'll leave you to talk about those two topics. Yeah.
Northern Ireland first. I mean, there are two issues about Northern Ireland, I suppose. First is the immediate issue about the protocol and its workings. The checks have been suspended because of, I mean, there is a real sort of fear of sectarian violence or of violence in Northern Ireland now because of the new checks, which of course for unionists are an anathema. The checks are real. There have to be checks. There have to be checks on goods traveling between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The protocol is not going to be scrapped. It's not in the interest of the UK or the EU to scrap the protocol, I don't think. I would be surprised if Boris Johnson delivers on the threat he made in Parliament yesterday to do so. Both sides have to give. The UK government has to be a lot more honest than it's been to date about the fact that it's signed a deal that means you will have checks within our national borders, which is at best weird and at worst politically toxic in Northern Ireland. The EU could be more flexible. I mean, you know, they could make arrangements. Seedling potatoes, why do they have to be checked? It's a big deal in Northern Ireland. You could give an exemption. I mean, there are ways, for instance, via audit of ensuring that goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland actually end up in supermarkets rather than ending up in the Republic of Ireland, which is the EU's main concern, which would allow you to relax some of the checks you're doing at the border now. You can say, okay, look, we're going to relax the checks in a sign of good faith. We will revisit via audit whether those goods that said they were going to Northern Ireland supermarkets actually are. And if they are, that's fine. We have no problem with that. If it turns out they weren't, we're going to have to revisit the check. So I think both sides can give some ground. I mean, there's a wonderful little article to be written on the politics of food, isn't there? But, you know, the sheer symbolism of the fact that from the 1st of July, British sausages might not be able to be exported into Northern Ireland. The reasons for which are so weird, it's worth enumerating, because the EU isn't in the habit of importing chilled food from near neighbours, because they're talking about trade deals with New Zealand, and you know, you wouldn't want to import chilled food from New Zealand because it would probably be quite smelly by the time it arrived. So it's frozen. But these little loopholes are what is catching us out at the moment. So I suspect on the protocol we can negotiate something that gives both sides a little bit, but not as much as the British government in its more sort of ambitious rhetoric has claimed it can get. Will there be a border poll? I don't think for a while, though there is no doubt at all that public opinion has been shifted by Brexit and that there has been an uptick in support for a border for unification on the island of Ireland. Nowhere near a majority yet, I don't think, in Northern Ireland, but you know, it's very uncertain. Scotland, what has happened very, very clearly is Brexit has bolstered support for independence. We've now had, I think, the last 22 credible polls have shown a majority, some of them a significant majority for independence. It looks likely, though the SNP is totally riven by internal arguments at the moment, and that could all fall apart, but assuming it doesn't, it looks likely that they will win a majority at the elections whenever they are held. They're scheduled for May. I don't think the formal go-ahead has been given yet because of the pandemic. If they win a majority, Nicola Sturgeon says they're going to ask for a referendum. Ask is the key word. It's up to the UK government to decide whether or not to issue a Section 30 order that allows them to have a referendum. Boris Johnson will say no. So we'll end up with a standoff. What happens there, I don't know, but I find it just hard to believe that Boris Johnson will allow the SNP a referendum before the next election. The SNP could try going Catalonia then. I don't think they want to, though there are some in the party who are far more in a hurry than Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon wants to play the longer game. The other thing I'd say about Scotland is that Brexit, whilst it makes the emotional argument for independence a lot stronger, you know, the bloody English have ripped us out of Europe against our will, makes the practical case a slightly harder sell, because of the nature of the trade deal with the European Union, which is quite a hard Brexit. We're out of the single market and the customs union. If Scotland leaves the United Kingdom and joins the European Union, we will have to have a border between Scotland and England, a customs and regulatory border of the kind we've got in Northern Ireland. The EU will not make the sort of special provisions for Scotland they made for Northern Ireland that allows Northern Ireland to be in the customs union but not. There will be far more black and white about it. And I suspect that will be a hard sell. If you go to either our website or the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE's website, the CEP and Thomas Sampson put out a really interesting report yesterday on the economics of Scottish independence. And if you think the figures I showed you were eye-watering, wait till you read some of those. And actually, one of the interesting findings of that were, one of the arguments you'll hear is the economic impact, the economic hit of independence for Scotland can be sort of counteracted by joining the European Union. Isn't true according to their modelling, because what they say is the impact of Scotland joining the European Union post-independence is zero, because any gains from trade you get from joining the European Union will be exactly offset by the losses in trade, by the barriers you'd have to erect to trade with England.
All right. So an interesting question about the impact on the what Brexit's impact will be on the internationalization of British academia, both in terms of students and scholars.
I mean, this is the other thing I should have said in my talk, is it's so hard to think about conclusions or implications during the pandemic, because of course people aren't doing what they used to do. People aren't traveling and moving as they used to do. So we won't know the full impact until we see that. In the short term, there is an implication for students, because of course EU students are going to have to start paying international fees. It's going to get a lot more expensive for them to come to UK universities from, I think, the fall, so from the October of this year. In terms of UK academia, well, there are already a lot of anecdotal stories. I've not seen any sort of quantitative data of this, of people leaving or not taking up jobs. You hear a lot of stories about people from the EU sort of interviewing for jobs and then actually saying, no, actually not particularly, thank you very much. That will have an impact on British academia. And even though we are still going to participate in bits of the Horizon programme, okay, although we're not doing Erasmus and things like that, what a lot of colleagues have said to me over the last 3 or 4 years is, yeah, we can still participate, but no one's asking us to. You know, people in other universities are thinking twice about inviting Brits to participate in their networks, partly because of uncertainty. Who knows if Boris Johnson is going to change his mind and pull us out halfway through is one of the things. You know, we don't know where we're going to end up. But secondly, too, because of paperwork. You know, I think, I haven't checked this, but I think that if I were going to go and give a paid lecture at the EUI, chance would be a fine thing, I'd probably need to get a visa. Or I'd ask them to get a visa. So there's just additional paperwork and all that sort of stuff that will make it trickier and might make people think twice about collaborating with Brits. That being said, we've got some great universities. Life sciences aren't suddenly going to leave Cambridge and head to the EMA in Holland because of Brexit, but it will have some marginal impact. And we will see, you know, I suspect the immediate implication will be a weakening of UK academia.
Well, and the UK also will no longer be part of the Erasmus program, right? Which also means that sort of mobility of students around Europe will also be, and that will have long-term implications as well. Okay, so let's see, to shift gears perhaps. So a question on identity issues. So the question is, are you aware of additional evidence of how these identities are shaping not only retrospective attitudes towards Brexit, but also evaluations of its impact as we see the damage unfold? So identity is obviously remain versus leaver, but also sort of identity in terms of the values you talked about, in terms of conservative versus social liberal values, things like that.
Which is essentially leave versus remain anyway.
Right.
The evidence, and this is Sarah Hobart again, if you look at, she's done something that's out in the British Journal of Political Science quite soon, I think, and I think the working paper is up somewhere. She writes so much, I struggle to keep track, but there was a piece recently in which she was talking about the way in which your identity and your values shape your perceptions, and her findings are quite clear that, you know, your view not just of the future prospects of the country, but of how the country is performing now are shaped by that lens. So more leavers think the UK economy is doing very well than remainers. Remainers tend to think the UK economy is doing dreadfully. So there is absolutely no doubt that these things shape your perceptions of the state of the country. There is as well, I'm sorry to do a load of plugs, but this is just stuff that's in my mind. On our website, there is a long read by Paula Surridge, who's one of the sort of smartest academics who works on these values questions. And she's done a sort of 4,000 word essay that is a kind of introduction to people. All the stuff on our site is for non-academics, so we assume that you don't know any of this stuff, and it's a sort of introduction to the issue of values that sort of points you in the direction of the best literature and things. So if you're interested in that, I would have a look at that, to be honest.
Great, thank you. And we've put the UK and Changing Europe's website up on.
Brilliant, thank you.
In the chat. So please, and I'll reference a few things at the end as well, but lots of really great information and on that website that if you're interested, you can check out after the talk. Okay, so we have a few questions kind of circling back to kind of the question, sort of economic questions. So a couple of those, the effect of Brexit on the value of the pound. As we move forward, as well as sort of the impact of Brexit on sort of the Eurozone for the, members of the Eurozone, as well as for the UK as well.
The impact of Brexit on the Eurozone, well, I think the Swedes hate us because we've just, we've left the Euro out far, far more exposed now without our presence. And it's far harder, I think, for the outs to remain out now. There's, the Euro is where the action is. Now, there are still, it's interesting, isn't it, that Macron suggested that there would be a fund for the Eurozone countries, which turned into the recovery fund in some way, shape or form. There is still that curious disjuncture at the heart of the European Union between Euro ins and outs, but I think the arguments of the outs are going to be less heard now that the noisy Brits aren't among them. In terms of the pound, I mean, I don't know. I mean, for me, one of the key short-term things is recovery from the pandemic. If our vaccine rollout program is as effective as it looks like it might be, and that means that we can emerge from lockdown significantly earlier than other countries, then I think the pound will get bumped. It'll go up because of that. I think our economy will start sort of kicking off quickly. But in the longer term, who knows? I mean, it's gonna depend on a whole load of things, not least this sort of long run impact of Brexit and what happens to various different sectors of the UK economy. I also think that decision on equivalence will be important for that, whether or not financial services gets anything out of the European Union or not.
Great. So a few questions sort of on COVID as well, not just sort of the economic fallout within the UK, but we have a question on sort of I think what this person is getting at is the effect, if you think there will be an effect of COVID on sort of the movement of people, not only sort of, sort of movement of, of people and sort of across the channel and things like that. If we've seen some of that obviously from a Brexit perspective, but if COVID will continue that trend.
It's impossible to say, isn't it, at this point? I mean, wrapped up in that are a lot of questions about whether, this is partly personal taste, isn't it? I can't believe any sane person would prefer Zoom to actually going to Paris. I mean, but, maybe habits will change. I don't know. It'll become harder to travel. in all sorts of ways, whether it is, whether you need to to register your pet if you're going with your dog, as a lot of people do, whether it is because you're going through the different passport line when you arrive in France. I mean, let's face it, French passport agents are going to be absolute shits to us. I mean, you just know that, don't you? They're going to have a field day with Brits going in. So it'll get slower. You'll need a visa if you have to go for work, which will change things quite fundamentally. So I can't believe there won't be changes. And of course, bear in mind at the moment that Eurotunnel looks likely to go bankrupt unless it's bailed out. So actually, one way of crossing over we might be deprived. I can't believe no one will buy it, given that the tunnels and the tunnel and the trains are there. But I think it'll be a while before levels of travel get back to their pre-pandemic level. People might be cautious as well. Though, having said that, levels of trade and traffic at Dover, it was saying in the FT today, have virtually reached pre-pandemic levels again. So in trade, it might go back. Services as well. Will British service providers be as keen to ply their wares in the EU now because of the hassle? Will EU customers want to go through the hassle of getting a UK architect with all the paperwork that will now involve, when you might as well go to another member state and get one? So I suspect there will be a drop-off, both professionally and in terms of people holidaying.
So to your comment on Dover and on, the freight, the images of the lorries being backed up at the border and all of that, a comment about just that. We've read a lot in the papers about freight being stuck at the UK-EU border. Are these just temporary implementation hiccups, or is the deal simply dysfunctional and will have to be rewritten sooner rather than later?
Well, I mean, if you're a haulier, the deal is deeply dysfunctional. Absolutely. It makes your life a misery in all sorts of ways, not just hauliers, coach drivers, for instance, under the rules of cabotage now. If you're running coach tours into the European Union, you're a British coach firm, you can only stop twice. Then you've got to go home. So actually, business will shift to EU operators. Is it short term? Some of it is. Some of it is the sort of famous Michael Gove teething trouble that you have truckers turning up at the ports without the paperwork, or with the paperwork incorrectly filled in, or they have this thing called groupage where you'll have several different products in the back of a lorry, all of which needs its own paperwork. So the business model is changing. A lot of hauliers are refusing to do groupage now because it's just too messy. One of the things we don't know, the volumes seem to be getting back to where they were, is whether or not a lot of the European lorries that are coming into the UK are going back empty, just because they're fearing disruption at the port. So that means, there is less trade because they're just fleeing. And there is absolutely no doubt that the nature of trade will change, and that either there will be queues, because if you have the same volume carrying the same amount of stuff with different rules, it's going to look different, logic suggests. Or if you don't have disruption, that's because of trade diversion. People just decided it's not worth it. I can't afford to do that. My company can no longer export to France. Again, we'll have to wait till post-pandemic to be absolutely certain. This isn't just, it's worth pointing out, this isn't just a UK-EU phenomenon. It's a GB-NI phenomenon, but it's also a Republic of Ireland GB phenomenon. Hauliers in the Republic are absolutely furious because of the delays they're facing in Dublin to send stuff over to Great Britain. And it might be actually that you'll see some trade diversion from Dublin to Larne and Belfast, because of course the UK government isn't going to check stuff coming from Northern Ireland.
So, and feel free to take a pause and grab a drink.
No, it's all right.
Running you through your paces here.
I can't keep up with all these. We might as well get through as many of them as we possibly can.
Well, I think this shows how much interest there still is, very much so, in really trying to understand what the effects are of Brexit. So to shift gears a little bit, there's a question about the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK. And this is in reference to a figure, and perhaps you can remind everyone of this figure. This was the Ipsos figures looking at salience and of different issues. And why do you think that the salience for the NHS has fallen during the pandemic in terms of an issue that voters are thinking about?
Because I think that's not affection for the NHS falling. that is degree of contestation politically about I mean, in a sense, it's because we all agree now about the NHS, or at least we all say we do. And I would suspect that is why that has fallen. Rather, that doesn't mean that no one's thinking about the NHS. I mean, the NHS has sort of taken on even greater cult-like status in the United Kingdom than it already had, and it had pretty damn great cult-like status already. And you've seen some really interesting things going on in the UK, like the government trying to badge everything as NHS, even if it isn't, because it thinks people would like it if it says NHS. But that would be my explanation for that, is because as a political issue, no one is saying, well, actually, let's privatise the NHS because it's rubbish now. Everyone's saying we love the NHS. And, the political parties are competing to show their love for the NHS. So it's less contestation.
Mm-hmm. That makes lots of sense. So to circle back to a previous question, and I think this one I wish I had seen this, or if it was up before, but we had already talked a little bit, you'd already talked a little bit about sort of the possibility of a Great Britain or UK-US trade deal. But the question is specifically about a trilateral deal now between the US, UK, and the EU, especially if a Labour-led administration takes over at the next general election in the UK.
The simple answer is I just don't know. I mean, I find it very hard to believe that a simple Labour government is going to take over at the next election, given the electoral mountain they have to climb. So we might end up with a coalition. That coalition might include the SNP. Then, of course, we're a little bit preoccupied with the future of our country rather than trade deals, because one of the prices that Labour pays for that will be a referendum. I'm not sure why the EU would want to sit down with us at the table as well in terms of trade. I can see why they might want to sit down with us about Iran or Russia or foreign policy issues, but when it comes to trade, they've got their own issues with the US, and I don't think they'll want us in the room, quite frankly.
All right, let's see. Okay, so there's been a few questions kind of getting back to the sort of winners and losers of Brexit. So let's see, I'll gather a few kind of the points on that. So one question about kind of the distribution of winners and losers by sector. So I assume sort of professional sector, economic sector is what that question is getting to. And then related to that, thinking more about from a regional perspective, a little bit just asking you to expound more on the data that about the regions that were sort of the winners and losers, and who may have benefited more by staying in the EU from a regional perspective.
Very, very hard to say on both. By sector, I suppose at the moment you can say that manufacturers have done a little bit better than service providers, but there'll be a whole, these things are never simple, are they? So you take car manufacturers, they're caught in a vortex, not just of Brexit, but of Dieselgate, of the shift to electric. There are all sorts of things buffeting that industry at the moment. And even before Brexit, you have a slight sort of shift of production, whether it's to Slovakia or increasingly to Turkey. So it's very, very hard to say by sector at the moment. I think financial services is badly affected because we're not going to get much at all in the way of a deal, but it's very resilient, and London has a lot of appeal for the financial services sector. So it swings and roundabouts, isn't it? Nissan, because of the specific carve out there was on rules of origin and electric car batteries, now thinks it sees an opportunity to get one over on its rivals by staying in the United Kingdom, but that's very niche. Not just sector specific, but company specific. So it is far, far too soon. I mean, I can sit here and guess, but I mean, you might as well sit here and guess, or anyone might sit here and guess. It's very, very hard to say. On regions, what I would say is, again, the jury is out amongst economists, but I mean, this is fundamental. Ultimately, the fate of regions in the UK is going to depend on what the UK government does. Okay, if the UK government decides we're going to rebalance the economy away from the southeast, and we're going to use money, we're going to use incentives, we're going to use the tax system, we're going to use infrastructure, we're going to empower local government, something will change. And one of the things about Brexit, I think, that is under remarked on is the degree to which it fundamentally shifted the political debate in the United Kingdom. You now have a conservative government that won't stop talking about regional inequality and the need to level up, for heaven's sake. I mean, who would have thought that when we were sort of, in the days of George Osborne and David Cameron? So that the political debate is now fundamentally different. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, as everyone knows, that anything will be done. Politicians are very good at talking. It's a lot harder to act. But I think that actually what we will see is areas of the country that, well, two things. One, you will see those so-called red wall seats where the Tories won seats from Labour that they never in their wildest dreams thought they'd ever win, will be utterly love-bombed by the government. You have a towns fund, you have all these funds now, and all the evidence shows that the money goes to places where the Conservatives won. So it's not by need, it's by politics. If you're a Conservative marginal in the north of England, you will probably do pretty well. So there will be a shift. Now, whether in the long term we can maintain that, whether in the fiscal tightening that is going to have to come at some point, that will be continued, we have to wait and see. But there are an awful lot of Conservative MPs in Parliament now whose future prospects depend on the government looking like it's delivering on levelling up. And so I think in that way, at least, we can see that things might work slightly differently going forward. There are loads of massive issues the government has yet to grasp. But one of the big reforms that we've had that hasn't been talked about enough is the so-called Green Book. The Treasury Green Book used to say that investment should be determined by returns. And what that meant, of course, was you kept investing in London because you get far greater returns investing in London than investing somewhere else. They've changed that stipulation now, and that should help see public money go to places that aren't doing as well, and there won't be such immediate returns, but it might help those places. I mean, they won't catch up in the foreseeable future, but narrow the gap.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a few more questions. So a few more questions kind of on the economic impact, specifically about prices and availability of basic goods in the UK. And I'll kind of run through these, and you can take them if answer whatever parts you want, so we can kind of get through them. So one question again on sort of prices and availability of goods. Question on non-tariff barriers. What non-tariff barriers will have the biggest drag on GDP? And then I guess the third one, and again, take these as you want, is what sort of entrepreneurial opportunities do you believe will arise in the near future in regards to supply chain issues? Is the UK in danger of losing competitive advantage?
Yes, is the simple answer to that, in the sense that, the margins of the car firms will be cut by this deal. Honda, I think a few years ago, estimated that a 15-minute delay at the ports would cost it about £1 million a year. Because Honda was an extreme case, but all the car manufacturers simply don't have warehousing. So they work on a model where the parts come in and get stuck on the car that they're building. And that's how it works. And it's very, very, it's timed to within an hour, this whole complex network. So yeah, it's going to make things more difficult. Well, the entrepreneurs are the people setting up customs advisories. I consult on customs and VAT requirements for trading with the EU. And the government's investing in customs agents as well. And there's a lot of pressure on the government to set up schemes to help companies. So I think in those areas, there is a lot of space. Though, of course, small companies won't be able to benefit from that particularly. Which non-tariff barriers will be worse for GDP? I don't really know. A more sectoral thing, for manufacturers, customs declarations are huge. So Make UK, which is a trade organisation for UK manufacturers, estimate that the cumulative cost just of customs declarations annually will be in the region of £5 to £6 billion. On top of that, certification, if you're doing lots of different products from your firm that need certification in the EU, each one of those certifications will cost you money. That will bleed into profits. If you're a big chemicals producer, for instance, you're now outside reach and you're having to register things twice. That has a massive impact because margins aren't great. Which non-tariff barriers ultimately will hit the UK economy more? I'm afraid I just don't know. It's a simple answer, sorry.
You're allowed not to have every answer to every question. All right, I think we have one final question that's moving in a bit of a different direction, which is focused now that the UK is out of the EU. If you expect Johnson to have any strong stance on democratic backsliding in Poland and Hungary.
Hi, Milada. I suspect he will be utterly instrumental and pragmatic about it, to be honest. I mean, on the one hand, he's setting himself up as this great liberal internationalist. So I don't think he'll want to cozy up too much. On the other hand, his great liberal internationalism has got nothing whatsoever to do with the European Union. I'd be surprised if the UK government got involved in that kind of thing at the moment, to be honest. We don't need the Hungarians for anything, so there's no reason to be cuddling up for them. There was a moment during the Brexit talks where we thought we might need them, and you had that rather unfortunate episode of government officials talking quite a lot with Hungarian officials. So I think they'll probably keep a distance. I don't think standing up to the Hungarian regime will be part of this great human rights-based liberal internationalist agenda. I think Boris Johnson has his eyes set rather further afield, and particularly on China.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I think as I said, we've put you through your paces here. I know all the audience members have really appreciated all of the presentation and all of your answers, and your willingness to say you don't know as well, which is to say that there's a lot we still don't know, right?
Stock answer.
Well, that's, it's good to recognize, but I think, to the point that there's a lot that we still don't know about the implications in the process, and the process probably we know, but the implications of all of that. And so
it's also worth saying there are things we probably won't know, just because, if someone in 10 years time say, what was the relative impact for those couple of years of COVID and Brexit? I can't think of a way you figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, so, which is all to say, we will be thinking about this, and we will be doing research on this for years to come.
Yeah.
So I want to, of course, thank Anand. And before I have my formal thank you, I'm going to put a few things in the chat that are from the UK and Changing Europe website, a really fascinating report that has just come out called Brexit and Beyond, from which Anand's talk came from, but you, of course, are welcome to check that out, and lots of really interesting pieces in there from academics, some of whom have been mentioned, and others as well, looking at different aspects of the implications of Brexit. There is also the Brexit Witness Archive that is also on their website, and Anand said that very interesting to sort of look at various perspectives on Brexit from various individuals over the past, I guess now almost 5 years since the referendum vote. And there is also finally in the chat a survey link that if you for audience members, if you could take a few minutes just to fill that out, very helpful for us in planning future events as well. So that link is in the chat, and perhaps we can cut and paste it so it's further down in the chat. And then my last announcement before thanking Anand is if you for those that are interested in having perhaps in the history of European integration, I want to let you all know about a talk that we are having next week, a little bit earlier, next Thursday, or a little bit later at 12:30 instead of 12, from Megan Brown, who is assistant professor at Swarthmore College, and she'll be giving a talk titled Inescapable Liabilities, Locating Algeria in European Integration's History. So that should be a real interesting perspective on the beginning of the European integration process. And that information is also in the chat if you would like to learn more and to register. So with that, thank you all for your attentive participation and in today's talk. It's great to see so many people and so much interest in this topic. And thank you so much to Anand for listening to all of the questions and providing a really wonderful presentation and answers to so many of the questions that we all still have about this. So with that,
absolute pleasure, and I do hope we can catch up in person at some point.
Yes, and we would love to host you here in person and as well. So hopefully we will be able to do that. And to those of you in the US, have a good afternoon. Those of you in the UK and Europe, have a good evening, and hope to see you again.
Thanks, JJ. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.